life itself, what it means to be human, to exist. This is all being redefined by megalomaniac psychiatrists and money-grubbing pharmaceutical executives. And they've done it for money. If you've been listening to this show for a while, you know that I have been a longtime skeptic of the pharmaceutical industry. Pretty much everyone claims to be a skeptic of the pharmaceutical industry. People on the left are predisposed, you would think anyway, to hate big pharma because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, which you can put the word big in front of, and that means that it's evil. Many people on the right have become even more critical of big pharma in the last few years, especially because of how it has pushed the COVID vaccines. A push that now, by the way, as of a few weeks ago, officially includes children as young as 6 months old. So if you want to bring your baby in for a COVID vaccine, you can now do that, though I certainly wouldn't recommend it. And yet, a large preponderance of both groups, even while usually assuming a kind of skeptical posture towards this industry, will let big pharma entirely off the hook when it comes to psychiatric drugs. As of 2021, nearly 65 million Americans had been prescribed at least one psychiatric drug. Think about that for a second. 65 million Americans. Just 5 years before that, the number was 40 million. 40 million was already sky high. In 5 years, it's gone up over 20 million. 20% of the country is on medication for mental illness, and that number is climbing by multiple percentage points every year. Meanwhile, our health authorities, our so-called health authorities, tell us that the real crisis is untreated, read non-drugged, unprescribed mental illness. So they see the 65 million Americans on psychotropic drugs for mental illness, and they insist that the number is far too low. We actually needed to get it much higher. Should be 100 million, should be 150. It should be everybody. And I'm not joking about that either, because the DSM expands, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders expands with each new edition until every single human emotion, personality trait, proclivity, impulse has become a mental illness. And we're already at the point with the latest DSM where you can open it up and find probably at least 5 or 10 mental illnesses that would apply to you. So they, the health establishment, the medical establishment, they demand that more and more mentally ill, quote unquote, people, most of them suffering from things like depression or anxiety or ADHD, be identified and drugged immediately. Never mind the significant and often dangerous side effects of these drugs. Never mind that we're altering people's brains en masse. Never mind that we're diagnosing conditions that we barely understand and drugging them based on poorly supported and sometimes demonstrably false medical theories. Never mind all that. Just keep the drugs, and most importantly, the money flowing. This is what Big Pharma, along with doctors and psychiatrists, have been doing. And many people on both the left and right, who are normally quite eager to criticize the medical establishment, fall silent, as that same medical establishment declares millions upon millions of Americans mentally ill, so mentally ill that they need psychotropic drugs in order to function. On this point, many of Big Pharma critics are willing to simply take Big Pharma's word for it. Well, they say we're all mentally ill, so I guess we are. They might lie about everything else, these selective critics will say, but they would never lie about the best treatment for depression. They would never lie about that. Quite an odd claim when you think about it. And on the subject of depression, the, quote, mental illness that accounts for a large portion of that 65 million figure, it's been taken as gospel for many years that drugs are necessary to treat it because the condition is caused by a, quote unquote, chemical imbalance in the brain. This is an idea that people have absorbed from the culture and especially from propaganda from the drug companies. You know, this didn't end up out there by accident. This is what the drug companies want you to believe. It's a chemical imbalance, so we'll give you a little chemical in a pill and we'll fix it right up for you. And it's a doctrine that is jealously guarded and defended. I know from experience that if you question it, if you dare suggest that maybe there's more to it than a chemical imbalance, you will be viciously attacked for your heresy. People like the chemical imbalance idea because it seems simple. And because it totally absolves the individual from the responsibility to do anything to help solve their own mental troubles. It takes things like, lifestyle, diet, etc., takes that out of the equation entirely. It gives a simple cause, promises a simple solution, and one that requires almost no work on the part of the individual. Just take the pill, that's it. Take the pill and everything will be better. That's Big Pharma's motto. Take the pill, take the shot, everything will be fine. You solve your depression with a magic pill. Big Pharma makes billions, win-win for everybody, right? Well, wrong. The problem with the chemical imbalance idea, the one that has led to millions of people being put on psychiatric drugs, the one that has put billions and billions, hundreds of billions into the pockets of Big Pharma, the problem with that idea is that there was never any evidence to support it. It's a marketing slogan. It's not a medical diagnosis. And a study that was just released this week, this is truly, I don't use this phrase very often in a non-ironic way, but it is a bombshell study. Reported by The Guardian, finally blows the lid off of the whole scam. Here's the headline. Little evidence that chemical imbalance causes depression, UCL scientists find. Reading now from the study, it says, scientists have called into question the widespread use of antidepressants after a major review found no clear evidence that low serotonin levels are responsible for depression. Prescriptions for antidepressants have risen dramatically since the 1990s, with 1 in 6 adults and 2% of teenagers in England now being prescribed them. Millions more people around the world regularly use antidepressants. Quote, many people take antidepressants because they've been led to believe their depression has a biochemical cause, but this new research suggests that this belief is not grounded in evidence. This according to the study's lead author, Joanne Moncrief, a professor of psychiatry at University College London and consultant psychiatrist at Northeast London NHS Foundation Trust. Quote, it is always difficult to prove a negative, but I think we can safely say that after a vast amount of research conducted over several decades, there is no convincing evidence that depression is caused by serotonin abnormalities, particularly by lower levels or reduced activity of serotonin. Thousands of people suffer from side effects of antidepressants, including the severe withdrawal effects that can occur when people try to stop taking them, yet prescription rates continue to rise. We believe this situation has been driven partly by the false belief that depression is due to a chemical imbalance. It is high time to inform the public that this belief is not grounded in science. So it would seem that Big Pharma has made billions of dollars fixing a problem that does not exist. Depression certainly exists, don't get me wrong, but depression caused by a chemical imbalance is a myth. And it is a mythical creation that the antidepressants are meant to fix. It's something the pharmaceutical companies have made up, a problem they made up, and then gave us the cure for. Reading more from this report, which is just more and more damning for the pharmaceutical industry as you go along, it says, in the new analysis, researchers said 85 to 90% of the public believes depression is caused by low serotonin or a chemical imbalance. Most antidepressants are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, originally said to work by correcting abnormally low serotonin levels. The review published in the journal Molecular Psychiatry looked at studies examining serotonin and depression involving tens of thousands of people. One of the findings was that research comparing levels of serotonin and its breakdown products in the blood or brain fluids did not discover any difference between people diagnosed with depression and healthy people. The authors also looked at studies where serotonin levels were artificially lowered in hundreds of people and concluded that lowering serotonin in this way did not produce depression in hundreds of healthy volunteers. Other studies looked at the effects of stressful life events and found that the more stressful life events a person has experienced, the more likely they were to be depressed, showing the importance of external events. Who would have thought? Apparently, external events, the things that happen to us in our lives, the events that we're a part of, the things that we suffer from, the things that we encounter, all of that, your everyday life, these have a deep and lasting effect on our moods and our emotions and our mental states. Now, of course, even with this study, or rather without this study debunking the chemical imbalance theory, which was never really a theory actually, but more of an unproven and arbitrary guess. But before the study was even published, it was already obvious that the chemical imbalance idea made no sense. For one thing, in order to diagnose an imbalance, we must first have some idea of what the correct balance is supposed to be. And yet none, I would wager to say, none of the 90% of the public who believes in the chemical imbalance can articulately explain what sort of balance we're supposed to have in our brains. Oh, there's a chemical imbalance. Oh, really? Well, so what is our balance supposed to be exactly? What's like the ideal balance? Your online activity is not private. Data brokers track your habits, beliefs, and spending, then legally sell that information. Corporations use it to target ads. Platforms manipulate what you see. And during elections, it can be used to sway your vote. Protect your freedoms and your privacy like I do. You need ExpressVPN. With ExpressVPN, all my online activity gets rerouted through secure encrypted servers, so my internet provider has no way of seeing what I'm doing. It feels good to be online without having that sense that someone's looking over your shoulder, stealing your data. On top of that, ExpressVPN hides my IP address, the unique number that identifies you on the internet, which means data brokers can't track me or build a profile to sell. I was just traveling recently and used ExpressVPN when I was at the airport to protect my computer while I was working on my show. It's incredibly simple to use, just one click and you're protected, and it works across all of your devices, phones, tablets, smart TVs, desktop, and more. Plus, you can connect up to 8 devices at once, making it easy to share the same peace of mind and privacy with your whole family. Find out how you can get 4 months free by scanning the QR code on screen, clicking the link in the description box below, or by going to expressvpn.com/WalshYT. So I've warned you many times on this show, including recently, about the pharmaceutical and psychiatric industries and their mission, which they've embarked on together, hand in hand, to methodically identify, categorize, and medicalize every aspect of the human condition. Now, this, I believe, is one of the most consequential and catastrophic trends in modern life. It'd be difficult to overstate the severity or significance of this problem. Life itself, what it means to be human, to exist. This is all being redefined by megalomaniac psychiatrists and money-grubbing pharmaceutical executives. They have totally altered our image of ourselves, of what qualifies as normal human existence. And they've done it for money. And because they believe themselves to be gods who are somehow qualified to make these kinds of changes to human nature. Now, I've harped on this point quite a bit recently, and as if to prove my point and justify the many cumulative hours I've spent on it, the American Psychiatric Association has now officially declared that grief is a mental illness. Yes, if you are grieving the loss of a loved one, you are mentally ill. But only if your grief is prolonged, you see. Grief will heretofore be acceptable for a brief length of time, but if you have excessive grief which lasts longer than what is medically prescribed, you should consult a doctor immediately. Now, if it already disturbs you that we're talking about grief the way that Viagra commercials talk about erections, then you're paying attention, because it should disturb you. Yahoo has the news about the latest medical, or rather mental disorder to be added to a list of 300 others. Reading now, it says, as of last week, prolonged grief disorder officially became a new diagnosis in the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Despite the nearly decade-long debate on whether grief should need medical treatment, the diagnosis became official during a time when many Americans continue to experience ongoing disasters that have caused death and suffering, such as COVID-19. Now, you may be wondering, isn't grief normal? Isn't it the most human thing in the world to have grief? Isn't it an utterly essential, if painful, part of the human experience? Isn't the thought of a world numbed to grief actually horrifying? Isn't it literally something out of a Brave New World? Well, yes, that's all true. But you see, the psychiatrists and drug companies have decided that grief should only be allowed for a certain period of time. Beyond that threshold, a threshold they have simply just invented out of thin air, it must be treated with medication. So continuing. Characterized by incapacitating feelings of grief, prolonged grief disorder happens when a person loses someone close to them, like a friend or family member, within at least 6 months for children and adolescents, or within at least 12 months for adults, according to the APA. Typically, the bereaved individual experiences an intense yearning for or preoccupation with the deceased person, so much so that their reaction to the loss preoccupies them almost every day for at least a month. A month. Yes, the psychiatrist will allow you to feel grief for a month, just a month, before you're considered sick in the head, mentally diseased. Lose your mother to breast cancer, spouse dies in a car accident, child drowns in the pool. Well, you better be back to normal in 30 days or else we're stuffing drugs down your throat. But why should 30 days be the cutoff? Well, because, as it's explained, grief beyond a month is a problem because it begins to interfere with, quote, social norms. Reading again, their bereavement is considered to last longer than social norms, think 5 stages of grief, causing distress or problems functioning in important aspects of their lives, such as socially or occupationally. Other symptoms of prolonged grief disorder include identity disruption, feeling as if part of yourself has died, a marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain, intense loneliness, emotional numbness, or a feeling that life is meaningless, among others, according to the APA. Now, I don't think I can fully describe how much I hate this. I cannot sufficiently capture the boiling rage that I feel deep within my inner being when I think about what these lunatics are doing to people. Though I'm sure my moral disgust towards the pharmaceutical industry and psychiatric community is also a symptom of mental illness. I no doubt suffer from chronic pharmaceutical skepticism disorder. If that's not in the DSM yet, it will be. And if you have any doubts about the motivation behind all of this, the next paragraph should clear that up for you. It says, inclusion of prolonged grief disorder in the DSM means that clinicians can now bill insurance companies for treating people for the condition, reports the New York Times. Currently, clinical trials are testing the drug naltrexone, which is a drug used to help treat addiction as a form of grief therapy. And according to the New York Times, the development will likely set off a stream of pharmaceutical research on other potential prescriptions. Oh, I'm sure it will. Would you look at that? What a coincidence. The people involved in making up these disorders also happen to be in a position where they'll profit to the tune of billions of dollars off of the disorders they've invented. Just a coincidence, of course. Meanwhile, the APA put out a video explaining more about the disorder, and the explanation directly from the horse's mouth doesn't sound any better to me. Listen.
What makes this different from normal grieving is, even though the symptoms appear very understandable, yearning and pining and missing the person desperately, that seems pretty normal after the loss of a loved one. But what we find is that those people who are really stuck and have intense levels, even at the very beginning, very intense levels, where they don't know who they are without this person anymore, those people oftentimes, a small minority, about 4%, will not get better. They'll just spend and eke out the rest of their existence missing this person and wanting to be reunited with them. And that part is not helpful. It's not helpful to ignore the fact that some people get stuck and could use some assistance and support in reintegrating into a life without this important person who died.
It's not helpful. Your grief is not helpful. Let's just make a couple points here. First of all, nobody is disagreeing with the idea that people in grief need and deserve assistance and support. Nobody's any problem with that. I mean, we've always treated grief that way. There are support groups, counseling, all kinds of different resources available, and which ought to be available, and that's good. But listen to the way Nurse Ratched in the video is talking about grief. She says it's not helpful. She speaks of normal grief as opposed to intense grief. She talks about grief as a symptom, which says that it's a disease in which the goal is to get better in the way that you might get better after a bad cold. This is all profoundly wrong. Here's the reality. Nobody, I don't care how many letters they have in front of their name, nobody is in a position to declare what sort of grief is normal. There is no normal or right way to grieve. And even if you can look at all the grief that all humans experience and somehow categorize it and average it out and come up with a baseline, that doesn't mean that every person who experiences the loss of a loved one ought to be expected to now stay at that baseline level. What kind of madness is that? Well, listen, we've discovered that on average, most people grieve their dead fathers for this amount of time, so we'll need you to keep your grief within those parameters too. Anything beyond that is just not helpful. The real mental sickness here is in the deranged narcissist coming up with this stuff. Grief is not a sickness. It's not fun either. It's painful. It can be devastating. I mean, it can ruin your life. Depending on who you lost and how, it can certainly change the course of your life. And it's possible that the sadness that you experience will stay with you forever, for as long as you live. But just because this reality of life is difficult, that doesn't mean it's an illness. That doesn't mean we need a drug for it. At a certain point, our society needs to understand this basic concept. Not every difficult or painful human experience can be solved with drugs. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called A Grief Observed after the death of his wife. It's a beautiful reflection of grief, but given that he was still deeply grieving his beloved even after 30 days had passed, very unhelpfully, the APA would now probably say that the book is nothing but the ramblings of a mental patient, a mentally ill guy. He should have simply been given a heavy dose of psychotropic medication. That's it. But in any case, C.S. Lewis wrote that in the book, he said that sometimes there is nothing to do with suffering but suffer it. Meaning not that a suffering person should be abandoned to their pain, but simply that some painful feelings, the deepest ones especially, must be felt. They must be experienced. There's nothing else to do with them. You could try to numb them into oblivion, but that's not going to solve anything. It might make it easier for you to reintegrate into society. And it might be the best thing for the economy and, for your managers at work. But it's not the best thing for you as a human being, as a person, which is what you are. After all, what is grief? Well, grief is love deprived of its object. Somebody said somewhere that grief is love with no place to go. You grieve because you loved and you still love. You can't make grief a mental illness without making love itself a mental illness, because grief is love. Now, God forbid, if I were to lose my wife or one of my children, I would never get over it. I would never get better in the sense of being back to normal, back to how I was before. I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get back to a life where it's like they never existed, because I love them more than life itself. I would gladly die in their place if that was an option. C.S. Lewis said that grief is like an amputation. It does in fact feel like a part of yourself is gone, because it is. The psychiatrists now say that such a feeling is abnormal. It's beyond average. It's aberrant. It's departing from the accepted standard. But actually, such a feeling is simply human. It's how a person feels after losing someone they love deeply. A drug can't solve grief unless they come up with a drug to raise the dead. Absent that, the absence which causes the grief will remain forever, for as long as you live. And so you can either feel that absence and have the pain which comes with it, or you can numb it with a drug so that your loved one is still gone and you still miss them, but you don't feel it anymore. Now, I can understand the temptation to seek refuge in numbness, but that's not what we should be encouraging people to do. Rather, we should be helping them to live with the pain, to carry on in spite of their grief and with their grief. The problem is that there simply isn't very much money to be made in that endeavor. And that's all these people care about, is the money. And that ultimately is why the APA, the pharmaceutical industry, today are canceled.